On Sunday, the 18th of June at 8 a.m., Titan, a submersible, embarked on a 2-hour descent to the Titanic wreckage, reaching a depth of 3,810 meters.
Can you give us like little sounds of it going? Bloop, 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 bloop.
Blub, blub, blub. At 9:45 a.m., contact between the submersible and the surface vessel was lost.
I don't think there was a sound of wind, but carry on.
At 3 p.m., Titan was scheduled to return but failed to appear. And obviously in that time, they were hoping it might have lost contact, but it would have conducted its voyage and come back up somewhere else. It did not. And at 5:40 p.m., the US Coast Guard received notification of an overdue submersible originating from the research vessel Polar Prince, which was about 900 nautical miles east of Cape Cod. And I suppose it was in the time after that when the Coast Guard began search that this would have made the news.
Exactly. So we are, of course, referencing the recent submarine accident that happened off the coast of America/Canada.
Yeah,
very close to
Newfoundland.
them too. Yeah, Newfoundland. And I think the reason we've turned this into an episode is because, as interesting as it was, I found watching the whole thing, it kind of made it felt so obvious and inobvious at the same time. I was like, why is this news? Because it was deeply interesting and engaging. It was one of the first bits of news that I actually like followed a little bit in a while. But on the other hand, I was like, this is so irrelevant. It's a very small number of people who consented and chose to do something incredibly dangerous and frankly a bit stupid, and paid a ridiculous amount of money to do it. And we were then also throwing a bunch of money to try and save them. I didn't follow this specific part too closely. I didn't investigate this too closely, but it sounds like a lot of the evidence was that they actually, at the point they lost contact, there was basically a problem with the hull, and it just immediately it was just crushed.
I believe it suffered an implosion, and that meant that hopefully in inverted commas, hopefully it was pretty sudden, and therefore it wasn't that they were like suffering for 96 hours.
Which if I had to choose between the two, I think I'd rather just instant sudden death. But yes, it led to the question, what makes something news? Hi everybody, welcome to the Morality of Everyday Things. I am Anthony.
I'm Jacob.
And we discuss everyday moral questions, such as today. I guess the question is, should you take a submarine? No, the question will be, what makes something news? The trials and tribulations of the Titan sea submarine, submaritime device, and Voyager. And we'll be exploring basically what are the features of stories that make them newsworthy, get them picked up, get them to get attention, but then also talking a little more about what is the point of news, and particularly maybe some of the cynical perspectives on how news is created in the modern day.
I suppose it's worth saying up front, due respect to the situation, it's obviously extremely sad for the people involved. On this podcast, we like to ask the difficult questions. So if we're doing so here, we don't mean to do so in any way that's insensitive. But we...
Look at him, he's so considerate.
Thank you.
I'll admit I've enjoyed the memes.
But we did think this particular story was a very interesting vehicle to this question, this wider question around news, because as we alluded to in the introduction, while it was an extremely engaging story, it took up a lot of news time that therefore wasn't dedicated to other stories, which from a plainly utilitarian perspective, you could argue have a wider sort of moral impact in the world. And that's I guess I just want to say up front, that's kind of the angle we're approaching it from.
So to jump into the written script, yes, 5 people's lives were at stake, and we don't want to make light of that. But beyond the news, as I mentioned, we mobilized huge resources. I mean, like the number of people, if you think about the amount of money sending these guys out there, trying to search down there, all for 5 people who had chosen to do something incredibly risky. However, at the same time, hundreds of people are regularly dying in attempted sea crossings in the Mediterranean and from France to the UK, the Channel. Ironically, at the exact same time that we were having this submarine news, one of the worst sinkings of a refugee vessel happened in the Mediterranean off the coast of Greece. Several hundred people died. And part of what really made me think, like, what makes something news was this wasn't coming up. And a lot of people were being very sanctimonious about, we're talking about people's lives. And I was like, but that's not really the thing that we're measuring this by, right? Because a lot of people are dying all the time, and we're not reporting that. And actually, I gave that example of a sea crossing. I mean, that's only relevant because it's an anecdote that feels kind of similar. It's people dying
It's
at
got
sea.
a nautical theme.
Yeah, it has a nautical theme, like a Pashmina Afghan.
It's a Lonely
Yeah.
Island.
Yes,
reference.
yes. However, I mean, at the same time, millions are dying in preventable circumstances every day, and they don't make the news. And in honesty, they wouldn't have caught my attention in the same way. This is part of what made me feel a little guilty, because I was like, I'm actually enjoying this, so maybe this is news. So it really made me reflect a little bit on the practical terms of that. It really makes that practical question: what should be news? What makes good news? Good inverted commas. But then also, what are the incentives of newsmakers? And also the moral imperative: what should the aim of news be?
So, yeah, and take it away.
The first thing I did, like any sensible person, was I Googled newsworthiness. And in fact, actually, Jake linked me an article on newsworthiness.
Yeah, I did it as well. I was curious as to, like, I wanted to take like a sort of principles first approach of like, we're not looking for examples here. We're looking for like what principles, characteristics make for good newsworthiness. And I was pretty confident there would be models of this, and we found a few, and I guess kind of combined them together, right?
Here you go. The interesting thing was you linked me something from the University of Omaha, and it just listed 7 or 8 principles, and I said, these make sense. But then I got to the end, and there was nothing there explaining them. And I looked at a few more references, and they all seem to reference the same 7 or 8. And that's when I was like, okay, this is getting weird. So I did a little bit of digging. I was like, this must refer to something at some point. And that's when I came upon the framework of newsworthiness developed by Johan Galtung and Mari Holombo Ruge from a 1965 study called The Structure of Foreign News. And just to give some context on that, the study was done with reference to particularly international news, and I don't know why, but it was very see the letter, not the place where people have been dying, based. It was particularly a study of news relating to. They analyzed the news coverage of 3 international events: the Congo crisis, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the Cyprus crisis. 12 factors that they believed influenced the selection of news stories were, or 12 most prominent, and then many people kind of distilled this down to 7 or 8.
I looked at them, and a couple looked like they're sort of overlapping, right?
Exactly, yeah. So they a couple of them are overlapping, so people tend to distill it to the 7 that your link had shown me.
Eliteness and prominence, as you will see.
The 12 kind of main ones that they put forward were: impact. Does the story have an impact on people's lives? Timeliness. Is the story new and timely? Proximity. Does the story happen close to home? Prominence. Does the story involve famous or important people? Conflict. Does the story involve conflict or controversy? Human interest. Does the story have a human element that will appeal to readers? Okay, that makes like big data stories harder to appeal to. Novelty. Is the story unusual or unexpected? That's a very big one. Relevance. Is the story relevant specifically to this news outlet's audience? Eliteness. Does the story involve powerful or influential people or institutions? Negativity. Does the story have a negative or harmful tone?
For Facebook.
Yes. Unambiguity, ironically a hard word to say. Is the story clear and easy to understand? And comprehensibility. Is the story understandable to the news outlet's audience specifically?
I mean, it's so interesting looking through that and thinking of the Titan story and having that front of mind, because almost as a sort of checklist exercise, you can go through and you can say impact. No, it doesn't really have an impact on people's lives. Timeliness, massively timely. And the thing about it that was so interesting was
there was basically a countdown time.
It had a ticking time bomb, right? Of like, everyone knew the vessel had 96 hours. So there was this real sense of, will they find it? Proximity,
it's somewhat. I mean, the fact that it was off the coast of the US, I think is part of what got it really onto news media. Yeah.
Prominence, yes. I mean, famous, not so much, but certainly important people. There were a few billionaires, right, on the ship. Was there, how many were 1, 2? At least a couple.
The founder, I think the
Hamish
Pakistani
Harding,
guy,
right,
and the other guy was. They were all rich. You had to pay $250K per person to go on there. Conflict. Well, so this is interesting. I think you could kind of widen the perception of this. Some amount of conflict, or I mean, a symbolic conflict, in that these are all billionaires and we were wasting resource, and they were fighting for their lives. Perhaps a little stretch there, but I think you get what I mean.
I wondered if you were going to say spending 250 grand a ticket, where there's a sort of, to doing something sort of dangerous and leisureful, and you sort of think like that could. I feel like that was definitely an angle people took, right? And maybe that fits under the conflict I know. I'm not
As
sure.
in, it's money that could have been better used.
Could have been better used.
Yep.
They were consenting to doing something
Now,
dangerous. It's
this-
controversial.
Yeah, I think the two that it ticks so hard that the rest didn't even matter.
Mhm.
In fact, the three would be timeliness, as you mentioned. There is
Mhm.
a countdown timer. It makes it, hugely high stress, high drama. Also negativity. But then the two that, other than the time element, would be human interest. Does the story have a human element that will appeal to readers? It's the empathy of like, oh,
Human
imagine being
lives at stake,
in this
yeah.
situation. And then the other one is the novelty. It's just weird. Right?
Yeah.
That's why people loved it.
That was why it jumped out so
Yep.
much, right? It's like there's a submarine that is, off the coast trying to investigate the Titanic, which is obviously also like,
Yep.
there's massive interest.
There's
in that.
irony there.
Yeah.
Yep.
Oh my God, I haven't even thought of that, but you're right.
Yep.
So there's a lot of elements that really make it appeal.
Yep.
And then you're right. I mean, relevance, not really. Eliteness feels the same to me as prominence, but I guess.
Yes,
Yeah.
so that's how you'd maybe boil it down to 7 or 8. Like, are there important people?
Yeah.
And ambiguity and comprehensibility, again,
Yeah, super.
very, very understandable,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Like, why did this happen? They chose to go in a submarine. The submarine is dangerous.
Yeah.
Et cetera, et cetera. So this model of understanding the news, when you see this, it feels obvious now, but perhaps, in the 60s, this wasn't a given. And certainly there wasn't a formal framework. But a lot of these findings, for example, the fact that it's negativity, the fact that it's people who are prominent, understanding that how it impacts people, really the fact that it fails the impact one, it makes it surprising. It kept hold of the news cycle so long. It really helped accentuate, like, what are the incentives leading them to keep this in the news cycle? But in any case, this model of newsworthiness is still highly referenced. Many journalists and researchers will refer to it when thinking about what to include in the news. But it's also important to note that the model is not a perfect predictor. Like we said, this story failed a couple of them. And there are other factors that can really influence the selection of news stories. The main thing to consider is that there are some other frameworks that have been developed by sociologists and researchers over time.
Mhm.
The first one is the news value. A few to consider. The first one of these examples is the news values model.
Mhm.
This model identifies 6 news values: prominence, negativity, unexpectedness, timeliness, proximity, and relevance.
Is that kind of a more distilled version of what we've just looked at?
Exactly, yeah. And actually, this one, this news values model, when you think about the story through that lens, it sounds more relevant, right? The agenda setting model. Okay, so this is where you kind of reframe the level of the stack we're looking at, right? So this is, first of all, this is looking at it very passively. Like, okay, news stories come in and there's a criteria and then the best stories come out, right?
Mm-hmm.
But what if instead, as this model argues, the media plays a role in setting the public agenda by determining which issues are seen as important, okay? So in this case, this isn't to say that, like, we're now saying that submarines are a very important public policy area, but rather the selection to choose this over, for example, refugee vessels sinking is implicitly an agenda setting.
I see.
Activity.
So it's important by omission rather than necessarily by active decision to include it.
And then the second thing that relates to this, and these two models are really what we're going to focus on by talking about the work of Chomsky and Noam Chomsky and Jean Baudrillard. The second one is the framing model. And this model basically argues that the media shape the way people understand events by framing them in a particular way. So that's to say, the first one is this news value model that the original study we're talking about was referencing. This is really like, like I said, news comes in, there's a bunch of filters that decides what's newsworthy, best stories come out. But what if instead, actually, and this is part of why I found this question so interesting, like, why is this submarine taking up so much news time? What if instead news creating institutions actually, one, have an active role in agenda setting, and hence it's a key criteria for selecting news, rather than what morally you may say should be keeping people informed or helping to give attention to causes that we can learn from. This is another thing about the submarine thing, right? What can we learn from that story? Practically, what other than it being interesting to follow, what practical? Whereas like the refugee crisis or I'll reference later, but the heat wave in India, these are news stories we can learn from. These are like, okay, the refugee crisis is getting worse. People are dying. We should do things about this.
And it sort of policy pressure.
Exactly.
Same way with climate policy for the
heat wave in June. Exactly. Whereas this, like, what is the takeaway from this? Billionaires are stupid.
I mean, this is the mad thing. There probably will be disproportionate reaction to it in the sense of like vessel safety, and there'll be, the Coast Guard will probably
ban private submarine things, and it's like, wow, that's a policy that affects 5 people,
right? And
ironic I said that number. But
did you not do that on purpose?
No.
But that's it. This reminds me of Daniel Kahneman, the famous economist psychologist's work on the availability bias, which is the sensational news that creates a stir has a disproportionate effect on decisions you go on to make in the future, because you can easily recall events like that. So it's like the impact 9/11 had on airplane tourism.
Yeah.
Actually drove more people to drive cars to travel around in the future, because people became disproportionately paranoid, even though
And I
air
remember,
safety wasn't
ironically, that net caused more deaths because
it did, because road
car
safety
accidents
wasn't.
are much more
Yeah, that's
likely. But sorry, so the context I'm saying is, the takeaway from my seeing this story, just constantly blasted, made me think, like, what role does the news media have in setting what we should be thinking about or talking about? And then this other one is framing. And this model argues that the media shapes the way that people understand things, like I said. The thing that's interesting about this is, let's say that, like I mentioned, there was some realization afterwards that perhaps the Coast Guard very quickly actually knew that that the sub had imploded, actually quite early on from when they lost contact. Maybe that's the reason they lost contact. That was one of the suppositions, and that the Coast Guard wasn't actively searching for this vessel, right? But for that 96-hour window, there was still constant news updates, right? And when you think about that in a framing sense, and you think about existence, which has been something we've been speaking a little bit about in this context, it makes you realize how a lot of reality is really just things that we are passed through media that we then take to be real, and it becomes part of our existence more as an idea than as a practicality. As far as we were concerned, that submarine existed and it was sitting somewhere with 5 people upon the ocean. And then we were told that actually never happened.
Yeah.
The thing just immediately crushed, right? Yeah. And it makes you realize that really it's not just that it framed, well, this is the point I'm getting to. It's not just that it frames how we view things, like, oh, we're looking at different angles. It's like, no, our reality exists purely through what we're shown. Because think about people who are, experts on the Iraq war, right? How many of them have ever been to Iraq? How many of them were there in Iraq during the war? I'm sure some number have, obviously. But even if you were there, okay, you're a human being with eyes. How much of it could you have seen for yourself? Right? And you start to get this realization that existence and reality, you simply can't capture all of it. So for context, people, we're going to talk a little bit using the context of something I'd written actually in reference to COVID. And a lot of the reporting around COVID, around constant, like, this is a second wave, this is a third wave. And I was like, well, what constitutes a wave? And the insistence on reporting numbers. People are still dying from COVID. We just don't report the numbers anymore. And you suddenly realize, like, wait a second, like, it's not just a framing thing. Like, this is no longer part of our reality because we're not letting it in. So
can I just ask on the frameworks? I just want to make sure I've got them clear in my mind.
Yeah.
So the news values model, which is similar to the Galton Rouge model, the agenda setting model, and the framing model, are they all competing on the same sort of level, or one subset of another, or like
it's actually,
are they a hierarchy? How does it stack?
It's more like they're explaining different parts of the system.
Okay,
right?
cool, because that's what it felt like to me.
Because framing and agenda setting, for example, can coexist, right? So if news is agenda setting, i.e., it plays an important role in telling people how they should feel about things, a large part of the way that they do that is by framing. They take the exact same event and they report it differently, right? Or they omit certain things, or what they choose to report and don't choose to report, right?
Nice. It felt to me as we were going up a chain. So like news value is kind of on the level of like a journalist being like, what makes a story good? And
yes,
the agenda setting model is almost like a more public level of like, the media has a role in determining what we care about, and that's how we sort of filter stories in the first. And then the framing model is almost like on a philosophical level of like,
yes,
we understand our world through.
So, well, actually, that is true, but I would actually put it agenda, as in, what is the incentives of the institution that makes news? What is the agenda it is trying to set? Framing, hence, given XYZ events, which events do we want to report on, and what is the perspective we're going to give in those reports?
Right.
And then at the bottom, it's the news values model, or that relates to those newsworthy impact things. It's like, okay, in order for this to stick, what are the criteria that I need to hit to make this a good news story?
Which is interesting because, as you say, you think of the news as being like, all this information is coming in, and the news is a filter that processes these like this massive chaos of inputs and produces coherent, readable outputs. But actually, it feels almost the other way around. It's like, you have an output that you want, and therefore you're kind of engineering.
That's exactly it. And I think this relates also trivially to our business experience, where like the more that you work in, say, for example, any small business, the more you realize that PR the more you realize that PR is totally made up, right? It's people reaching out. It's people who need to put stories out because that's their job. They're journalists, and it's people who are giving them, hey, here's something pre-written. Would you like to post it, right? And you realize how much of it, people assume there's authority, but there's not, and it's all agenda setting downwards, not stuff that's happening upwards.
Yeah, I suppose it's a little bit of both, but I definitely remember having that feeling when we would put PR out, and then journalists, you sort of have this. I had this impression that journalists were kind of going around sniffing for stories,
No, yeah.
and in fact, they've got a lot coming at them, and therefore they kind of
Mhm.
stuff that fits the agenda they're already given gets
Exactly.
through, and so on and so forth.
I think you realize as well, good journalists, even when they find an interesting story, it's a bit like the beauty of a documentary. You think like, well, why do you need a director for a documentary? It's just documenting stuff. And it's like, no, no, no.
Mm,
Good documentaries take realities and then how do I apply a narrative that makes this appealing, right?
mm,
So we're going to talk through some of these through the lens of the sociologist and philosopher Jean Baudrillard, and then, like I said, Noam Chomsky, who has a book called Manufacturing Consent, which it's pretty clear how that relates to the agenda setting, then framing, then specific what makes something newsworthy. So, guys, like I said, this actually is an excerpt from a essay I'd written around the way that COVID was being reported, right? So bear that in mind. There'd be some connections there. But we'll start actually from that framing perspective. We'll talk about how there's a difference between our perception of the world and the world as it is, and how, in a sense, that forms not just our perception of reality, but literally our lived reality.
mm-hmm.
Jake, do you want to tell us about Jean Baudrillard?
Jean Baudrillard was a French sociologist and philosopher who wrote extensively about the nature of reality and the role of the media in society. His work is often associated with postmodernism and specifically post-structuralism.
Mm.
Jean Baudrillard's Simulacra and Simulations is a seminal work in the field of postmodern theory, and basically in this book, he explores the concept of simulation, which refers to the process of creating copies or representations that come to replace the original reality they imitate. So, to break that down, here's a quick summary. Baudrillard argues that in contemporary society, we are surrounded by a proliferation of simulations, where the boundaries between reality and representation have become blurred. He suggests that simulations have replaced the real, and that now we live in a world dominated by signs and symbols rather than the actual reference that they represent. He introduces the concept of the simulacrum, you recognize from the title, which is an image or representation that has no connection to any underlying reality. According to Baudrillard, simulacra have 4 successive stages of development, and I will list them for you quickly here. The first stage is a faithful reproduction of the original, maintaining a clear distinction between the representation and the real. So I guess, a simulacrum has clearly been made. The second stage involves masking the absence of any original reality, creating an illusion of authenticity. The third stage sees the simulation replacing the reality entirely, with no reference to an original. This is starting to sound to me like Stalin and Trotsky. And the fourth stage is the hyperreal, where the simulations become more real than reality itself, leading to the loss of any meaningful distinction between the two.
So I suppose the first stage would be, if we're thinking, he famously wrote some essays on the Iraq War claiming they didn't happen, right? And I think the way that you might, for example, describe this is in the way that we reported that war, right?
Mm-hmm.
The first stage you could think of as literally just showing you photos and videos of the place, right?
So there's a
of
clear
stuff happening.
distinction. This is a photo.
Yeah.
Really happened, but you're looking at a photo or a report.
Exactly. Well, even the report. See, the second stage might be when you start to create a report and imply that this is the whole story. I'm giving you the story of what's happening in this photo by putting a few photos together, right?
Mm-hmm.
I am not saying that there's a few different things and I'm applying a narrative to this.
Mm-hmm.
At some point, you might then, get to stage 3, which is I'm not even showing you these photos. I'm just a news anchor describing to you something that's happened in Baghdad, right? So there's actually, I'm replacing the reality that I could share with you entirely. There's no reference to an original. I am just telling you that. And then the fourth stage is when you start to say, there is a big war happening in Iraq right now, when actually, and this is part of the point of his essays and things, it's mostly air bombing, it's little skirmishes, most people dying there are civilians. So what does it even mean to be a war? But I'm applying that narrative. This is something I've decided that I'm applying to how we perceive this event that's happening.
I see. It feels highly linked to the sort of questions around philosophy of language and what things mean, right?
Exactly. So semiotics would be the things around that. So to kind of carry on in that, in the vein of explaining his work, he argues that contemporary society is characterized by the dominance of that hyperreality. In this hyperreal world, simulations become so pervasive that they shape our perception of reality. Media, advertising, consumer culture all play a crucial role in constructing and perpetuating these. So he criticizes the idea of representation as a mirror reflecting reality. Instead, simulations are rather constructs that produce their own versions of reality. Again, like I said, his whole perspective is like there wasn't really a war in Iraq, right? There was a bunch of air bombing, some small skirmishes, mostly civilians being killed. But we've chosen to apply this narrative using small bits of reality. Well, sometimes not at all. Could be just news anchors talking, but sometimes selectively choosing it.
I see. That's sort of the penny feels like it's kind of dropped for me there. So hopefully it has if you're listening as well, because it's a little bit like what we were describing earlier, that difference between that perception that news is just sort of a distillation of facts versus actually, in this case, you're kind of telling stories and the stories take on a life of their own. And actually, like, it's not just a reflection of facts, hence his sort of his criticism that it's not a mirror reflecting reality. It is actually, in fact, a whole other entity. It's a story, it's a creation, a fabrication.
Yeah.
So it's not like, here are the facts and I'm sharing you them. It's like, actually, this is a whole, like,
here's a narrative that I'm telling you is
yeah.
based on reality, and you have no way of actually sense checking that hyper reality. This is what I was saying earlier, where it's like, how many people who are experts in Iraq have been to Iraq, right? All they've consumed is information about it, which in some sense can be hyper realities that people have created for you to consume.
And I guess a very real and easy example of this is propaganda, right? It's like,
Yes.
it's like all Napoleon's work to kind of present himself as like, I'm a leader conquering
Exactly.
France, when
Or
you know.
or likewise, people saying like immigrants stealing all our jobs, things like that.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, actually, is that happening? Or is this a narrative you're being told we're being invaded by immigrants? And it's like, well, wait, I don't see any immigrants invading. But it's as overwhelming. No, it's happening. It's happening. Like,
That's a very
I'm
good
told
example.
that this narrative is happening.
Because you're right. I mean, that obviously massively informed the Brexit vote, and many people will have based their vote on that belief that, you know, I'm going to lose my jobs, and other people have already lost theirs, and it's because this wave of immigration. And in fairness, I mean, yeah, it's not necessarily substantiated by real facts. It's a narrative that's
This
being.
is it. And it's not that they weren't living in their reality. It's just that their reality was a hyper reality that they were fed based on some loose connection to reality. So like I said, I'd written a little bit about COVID before that kind of explains some of this. So I'll kind of read that and see if it kind of clicks a little bit with that. The old adage goes, if a tree falls in the woods and nobody's there to hear it, did it make a sound? In a world,
is that a tree?
Yeah, I don't know. In a world vastly opened up to us by technology, where we're bombarded with information, our human inability to perceive every tree is apparent to us. We know there are many important, lived realities which in some sense do not exist to us. Such is the reason for the profound feeling of realization we experience when we do encounter some exposition of some element of external reality which was previously absent from our reality. It's frequently reflected in social media outpourings after a new must-watch Netflix documentary is released. So like Seaspiracy, Cowspiracy. It's like, how did I not know that this was real? This tree was falling the whole time.
Tiger King as well.
Exactly. What interests us so intensely is not just seeing a tree fall, but the realization that we somehow missed it for so long, that it had already fallen and we didn't even know. We voraciously consume media to try and capture a glimpse of every tree, as media becomes our window into these little realities, which we otherwise can't reach. What we may soon fail to realize is the selective way in which these windows show us some things and not others, how seeing some trees fall and having it so sensationalized may shift our view to encourage some wider view for the future of the forest, how we should feel about that beyond what one view of any one tree can tell us. The greatest directors and photographers don't just film or picture the world as it is. They choose what to keep in the frame and what to exclude with the intention of eliciting a certain emotion or idea. If you shoot a tree falling from the right angle, it can feel like the whole forest is coming down.
Rather poetic. I like it.
But does that give you a clearer idea of what of the meaning of his work?
Metaphorically, I suppose it's that you're not necessarily even looking at windows. Some of these windows are, in fact, paintings or screens.
Exactly. It's actually descriptions, right?
Yeah.
So the point of this is that the media doesn't just impartially update our views on reality. It, in fact, forms our reality. The reality it forms is a crude recreation that cannot be wholly representative of the objective world, and often is only loosely based on it, more appropriately understood as a loose collection of cultural symbols and ideas. We can call this a hyperreality, right? That's how it connects. And in fact, actually, hearing that specific description we gave earlier, hyperreality is when it's actually even intentionally divorced. It's not even loosely connected. This is what people are referring to when they say that people in social media bubbles, in some sense, live in different realities from each other, right? And Jean Baudrillard describes this concept in detail in his book and explains the concept in practical application in his collection of essays titled The Gulf War Did Not Take Place. So super quickly, whilst there was some great stuff there, the point of the essays isn't one of conspiracy. It's not literally like people weren't in the Gulf. It's what is a war and why were we calling it a war? When really it was some air bombing, some local civilians dying, some small skirmishes, and actually, a big fact, more people were dying at home in the US because of homicide than were dying in Iraq. So in a sense, there was more of a war happening in the US, but we didn't report that as a war. And so it wasn't a war. That's what this means by hyperreality.
It's interesting because when you think of people studying history as well, people will study the Gulf War because that became like an entry in the history books. But you're right, like even though all these deaths were occurring in the US, it was never marked as like a civil war. It was never marked as like a kind of crime wave or anything like that. Well, maybe it was the latter, but you're right. There's an interesting sense that you create your own history with literally the language you use to describe it and the narratives you put forward. I see.
And one thing to bear in mind that is super relevant to this, so I'll just read it really quickly. The divorce between reality and our constructed reality also comes into being through both the implicit and the explicit. So both what we are directly shown and told, but also what we are selectively not told.
What doesn't make it into the frame.
Exactly. So framing isn't just how you tell a story, it's also what stories you tell. So reporting on an Islamic terrorist mass shooting and saying it's terrible, whilst linking their actions to their beliefs, is explicitly layering narrative onto a little window into reality, right? Islam is dangerous. Disproportionately underreporting acts of terror committed by white men and labeling them as isolated incidents committed by crazy people and not putting the Islamist terror attacks into the real context that most US mass shootings are by white men, implicitly layers a different narrative. White people aren't dangerous, right? This leads neatly onto a specific framework the media put forward by Chomsky, that the media's aim is not to objectively report reality. So this is how they use their framing, but by giving us our reality as above, by forming a hyperreality, is in fact aimed at manufacturing consent and profits. And this again relates to what we're saying, where it's agenda setting.
Why consent and profits? So is this the agenda setting where the agenda is literally news exists to sell itself? Or is it higher level than that? Is it that it's reflecting business interests or political interests and the news serves those meanings as well?
Yeah. So one of the 5 core parts of like what filters or shapes news, one of the core ones is ownership, right? And so ownership might be interested in both profits and agenda setting, right? To their own. The agenda could be, I want to make profit. Right? The agenda could also be, I ideologically believe this, so I want people to agree with it, right? Or I want people to be told to think it. So do you want to tell us a little about Manufacturing Consent?
Yes, quickly on Manufacturing Consent. It's a book by Edward Herman and Noam Chomsky. Argues that mass communication media of the US are effective and powerful ideological institutions that carry out a system-supportive propaganda function by reliance on market forces, internalized assumptions, and self-censorship, and without overt coercion, by means of the propaganda model of communication. The title refers to the consent of the governed and derives from the phrase "the manufacture of consent" used by Walter Lippmann in Public Opinion 1922. We've also previously talked about that. So, like Ant was saying, there's 5 filters. He mentioned ownership already. These are the filters the authors believe shape the news. So you've got ownership, which is the media is owned by a small number of corporations that have a vested interest in maintaining the status quo. You've also got advertising. The media are dependent on advertising revenue, which gives advertisers a powerful influence over the content of the news.
Nothing too radical, or else you lose your advertisers.
Yep. Official sources. The media rely on official sources for information, which gives the government a powerful influence over the news.
And this is actually a two-way street where it's like, okay, I make you important by featuring you in the news, and you get to have influence over what's on the news, because otherwise you won't be willing to come.
There's a kind of like a symbiotic relationship, exactly, where you give and take information. Number 4 is flack. The media are sensitive to criticism from powerful groups, which discourages them from reporting on controversial issues. So even though the media is the 4th pillar of government, and not just government in this case, I suppose there's a sense of being careful not to upset the powerful or, cross a line that might lead to negative feedback.
Yep. And then the last one is marginalizing dissent. So whilst it can give a platform to dissenting voices, they're often marginalized and ignored because it simply doesn't serve the prior interests.
Interesting.
Yeah. So those being advertising ownership, being reliable so you can get those official sources, etc.
So can we kind of bring everything we've discussed back to the original sort of submarine question, and maybe marry these 2 points?
So using these 3 different frameworks where we're looking at different levels of the news, I think we can kind of see a practical way in which the submarine story was simply really newsworthy. It was interesting, it was novel, and to rich middle class audiences, it was maybe a little more relatable. The idea of people, dying while trying to have fun on holiday, which is sad. But on the other hand, maybe it was distasteful for how unrelatable it was. Or maybe it was relatable because everyone hates billionaires. But we can understand why, despite being less important news, it was newsworthy. If you reported innocent deaths or news according to impact on human life, the people drowning in refugee things, or people generally dying in say, for example, sub-Saharan Africa. Whilst important, you could report limitless amounts of that every day. And in a sense, although it's sad, it's no longer new. So it's not news.
This is a really interesting thing, and it links back to COVID, because COVID somehow did maintain its place in the news cycle with death figures every day in a way that, you don't see that with refugee figures. You don't see like deaths by refugee crossing every day. You don't see it with things like cancer or heart disease either, although those numbers would arguably be higher and would certainly create a real like agenda or kind of like motivation in the public. But you're right, there's a lack of newness, and COVID, I think, was exceptional because of the impact. Going all the way back to those sort of news metrics, COVID felt very relevant and very impactful and very proximate to everyone. And I suppose because of that, those death figures were, they were reported day after day after day, in a way that other things haven't. So yeah, it's interesting. And obviously, now the submarine story has kind of passed out of the news cycle. You had a few follow-up pieces. There'll probably be deeper analyses done in the future. But yeah, a few follow-up pieces saying, oh, this is what happened, and a sort of summary thing, but now it's gone.
Now no one cares.
Yeah. But for a short period, it was the biggest story on the world, right?
Yes, exactly. So the more cynical perspective, as you're kind of touching on, maybe the manufacturing consent perspective, is not just the decision that we were portraying this sub-maritime sitcom situation, but also
tragedy, really, rather than sitcom.
Exactly. But also, it's again, it's a decision of framing. It's what things weren't we talking about that week? What things? Maybe does this communicate that some news agencies have an incentive to talk about as little as possible? So, given any newsworthy thing, they would rather talk about something else. I mean, to what extent were people happy to talk about something other than the important things that were happening in Trump's indictment, right? Maybe part of the reason that we didn't report on the hundreds of people dying in the refugee crossing is because some vested interests don't want us to talk about that more than we need to, right? Maybe some vested interests don't want us to talk about the heat wave in June in India, right? And so we sensationalize and focus on more newsworthy things, but actually really what we're focusing on is distractions, right? If in the UK, what elements of Boris Johnson's ongoing corruption scandal was ignored in favor of talking about this, which you could have the defense of saying, but this is more newsworthy, right? I think in all, like, to kind of take this away, to finish it up, I'm not saying that I have an answer, or that there's no, I mean, the truth is all of this is a system. So no, if you're hearing this and you're a journalist and you're like, but I'm not trying to do X, Y, Z. There's a great interview, Chomsky, with a journalist, where they say that to him. They're like, I'm not trying, are you saying I'm trying to do all these things you're describing? He's like, no, but I'm saying if you didn't naturally do it, you wouldn't have been hired for this job, right? So it's really a description more of a system that has come about because of large policy factors, as opposed to some cabal of people who are planning this all together.
It feels that way, doesn't it? It feels similarly to when we talked about sort of capitalism as a wider system and problems of inequality, that it's not necessarily the fault of people who followed the incentive structures that capitalism creates. You're not making a sort of personal attack on those people, and in the same way, sort of journalists and media, people who work in the media aren't guilty of anything other than sort of following the incentives that are created for them.
Exactly.
But the question, I guess, to ask and to leave you with is, what should those incentives be? Because it does feel like these interests that the media represents aren't necessarily those that will create a more moral and better world.
Exactly.
If anything, it has the potential to do the opposite.
Yeah. But if anything, at the very least, the takeaway that you can take from this conversation is, maybe, I don't want to encourage everyone to be cynical all the time, but maybe be a little more cynical. Maybe next time that you see a news story, be like, why is this news? What am I not hearing about because I'm hearing about this? And how was that decision made?
And on that note,
yes, guys, sorry, there will be a lot of editing here, so because we had some issues. Thank you, guys. If you enjoyed that, please do leave a review, share it with friends, family, share it with your mom, whoever you think will take interest. Written reviews on Apple are hugely appreciated.
Yeah, we've seen a few of those recently, so thank you very much to people who've done that. And if you're on the WhatsApp group, looking forward to hearing your thoughts. And if you're not, join the WhatsApp group. It's been a great place where fans of the show have come together to ask us questions that we can take forward into the episodes and discuss and generate ideas for future episodes too.
Thank you, guys. Speak soon.
Hello, I am Violet Manners, the daughter of the 11th Duke and Duchess of Rutland and executive producer of Duchess the Podcast. Have you ever watched fantastic series like Downton Abbey, Bridgerton or The Crown and caught yourself daydreaming about what it would be like to experience a life like that? If so, then you're in for a treat with Duchess, where we embark on an exploration of the most remarkable historic homes of Great Britain and Ireland, delve into the authentic life stories of their present-day owners and uncover the incredible history behind these estates. Join us on this extraordinary journey through time, hosted by the real Duchess of Rutland, custodian of Belvoir Castle, and the Countess of Derby from Knowsley Hall. Discover Duchess the Podcast on your favourite podcast platform today.